Okay, so moving on to part two, we're going to look at the story Sonny's Blues by James Baldwin, who, as I mentioned before, is a great writer, and this story specifically is just, I think, one of the all time great stories. Um, the way this connects to part one with Flannery O'Connor's revelation is our question about the afterlife, right? And how do we get there? Well, O'Connor gives us this vision of it that is like very specific and clear. We actually see people moving toward it in that final quote. Um, Baldwin, on the other hand, gives us a story about life and death and um, how we conduct ourselves, how we live our lives. And if we read it in the context of Revelation and in the context of the prodigal son and those connections, then I think it becomes clear how it is a meditation on that. Even if that's not immediately clear, Baldwin was a very spiritual writer. He almost became a pastor, studied for it in the last minute, decided not to, and his writings usually engage with spiritual themes. For instance, his most famous novel is called Go Tell It on the Mountain. And while he eventually disagreed with some of the teachings of Christianity and didn't follow through with becoming a pastor for those reasons, he's still very much engaged with, even if he rejected, some Christian ideas. And his writing is always very spiritual. And as you see here, even though it's mainly about the relationship of two brothers and could have very easily fit into our discussion of the everyday use, and I could have paired those two stories together, it goes more vertical than that story. And he in the final two paragraphs, which I think I'll read to you, and I think are two of the greatest final paragraphs in all of literature, seems to be about the music and their lives, but it's about much more than that. It's about life and death, and I think you'll see where I'm going here. But I'm very much looking forward to discussing the story with you. Just gave a little bit of background on Baldwin in terms of his potential Christianity and his spirituality. Let's get a little more background on Baldwin before we dive. He was born in Harlem, and his writing was part of this movement called the Harlem Renaissance, which was just this flourishing of African American writing in the middle of the 20th century. Many writers from the U.S. at this time lived in France, and a lot of them called themselves expatriates, but he did not, which is interesting because the writers who lived in France, who were from the U.S. but lived in France during this time, wanted to distance themselves, or even so far as disconnect themselves from identifying with the U.S. But since Baldwin didn't accept that title of expatriate, it shows his own inner conflict over that kind of decision and how he sees issues as complex and nebulous and not simple, and doesn't reduce them to simple in his writing. In very much like Faulkner explores those complexities. As I mentioned, Go Tell It on the Mountain, published in 1953, is his most famous novel, and it helped establish Baldwin as one of the leading black voices of the 1950s and 1960s. So he's a very influential writer, which is one of the reasons why we're studying him. Part of his issue with the title of expatriate was that he felt it was reserved for white writers. He wrote on a variety of subjects, but Harlem and the African American experience remained the source of his most intense creative impulses. So writing about the African American experience in the U.S. was the absolutely most fundamental and essential part of his writing, and we'll see how that plays out in Sonny's Blues. So the big question here is, coming back to it, is what is the next step for the human race? With the sub-questions, is there an afterlife? How do we get there? And as I mentioned, this will kind of guide the next three lessons. So this one is, how do we get there? The next lesson is, there some divine being overseeing it? And in the final lesson, what is it like? Again, we just covered this on the last slide, or the last lecture, but to review, these are some of the biggest questions. These are questions I've grappled with all my life and still continue to grapple with today. And reading Revelation Reading Sonny's Blues has been instrumental for me in trying to understand these questions, and throwing the prodigal son in there um, is really just helps, I think. So on the one hand, I'll be giving you kind of a general analysis of Sonny's Blues and why it's such an important, impactful story. But then on another level, I'll be going a little more specific with why is it important to these particular questions, and how does it relate to the story of the prodigal son. Now, I want to clarify, I'm not actually going to lecture on um, the story of the prodigal son. I feel like it's fairly straightforward, and I want the main focus to be Sonny's Blues. But when we get to the discussion board, that's where you'll have, if you want to, you don't have to, that's where you'll have an opportunity to analyze the prodigal son and how it connects with the story. And so when we get where I'll really discuss the prodigal son is when we get to the discussion board question part of the lecture. But let's now take a look at Sonny's Blues and see how it engages with these questions. So a lot of themes or threads to pull on here. Some big ones are sibling and other familial relationships. So you can think back to Walker's everyday use, and I really think of here, you've got two sisters, African American, turmoil, disconnect between them, and then in Sonny's Blues, two African American brothers, but siblings, disconnect, turmoil between them. So many similarities. With the discussion board, you can go to, I have a question that'll allow you to go to, what are the differences in these sibling relationships in these two stories and how they play out. So even though the collection of readings this quarter may seem somewhat random, there's a lot of intentionality behind it on my part, and there's an important connection here to everyday use we read a few weeks ago. Along those lines, the effect of poverty and oppression on African American sibling and family relationships. Recall, Walker said that she sees troubled relationships in all families, but particularly in African American families, and asks if the oppression, the poverty, the racism, etc., that African Americans have experienced in the U.S., does that influence? And to what degree does it influence those broken sibling and family relationships? Union through tragedy. Here, for me, this is where this story makes a break from Walker's story, because the sisters are not united at the end of the story, but there's a connection between Sonny and his brother, the narrator, at the end of the story that's incredibly powerful. And it's tragedy is what unites them. And the narrator, Sonny's brother, who's never given a name, his own personal tragedy is what enables him to have pity, but more so than what we normally think of as pity, empathy for Sonny. And so this comes back to that first lesson on catharsis, right? And the ability to not just pity another character, but the Greek meaning of the word pity, see their struggle, see their pain, identify with it, sympathize with it, be united in that pain. One of the things I absolutely love about this story is its music. I love music. I listen to it as much as I can. And here we see truly the power of music. The final two paragraphs here show us the power of music, and I firmly believe that's what makes this one of the greatest stories of all time. But at the same time, we see a lot of the tragedy that happens on the music scene, because Sonny's brother blames the music scene, at least in part, for Sonny's drug addiction. And we know how much drugs are a part of the music scene. And so like I said before, Baldwin doesn't treat anything as simple. It's all very complex. I believe I've used these terms before, but open or closed denouement, which is just a fancy way of saying it's an ambiguous or unambiguous ending. So that being a French word that refers to closure or ending, if it's open, it's ambiguous. We don't know exactly what's going to happen. If it's closed denouement, then it's unambiguous. It's all tied up in a pretty bow for us. And this story is, we could talk about this with any story, but I introduced the concept here. It's particularly important in this story because we have Sonny's fate, right? He and his brother have connected at the end of the story, but he's had a hard life, and there's no guarantee here that he's going to not going to slip back into drugs, right? He could very well be doing heroin again soon. We don't know that for sure. And so we have this really beautiful ending, But in terms of the long term, it's not really closed denouement. And I think Baldwin is doing something intentional there, and he's really challenging us, pushing us to think. So the ending is something important we'll talk about. And obviously, I'm asking you to compare this story to the parable of the prodigal son. And what's interesting, in the parable of the prodigal son, you have two sons and their father. One is the partier who, just wants his inheritance so he can go spend it on, good hard living, food and drugs and prostitutes and whatever else you imagine here. And then you have the son who is the hard worker. But the prodigal son, he's a prodigal because he returns. He turns around and he comes back home. But before he can even get home, before he gets all the way to the house, even when he's just at the property line, his father sees him and runs to him. And that angers the older brother. He's saying, how could I have worked so hard? And you give him the fattened calf, you give him the party. And the father says, what's joyous, what we're celebrating is your brother has come home. It'd be one thing for the father to reward the prodigal if he were unrepentant, but he's repentant, he comes home. And so he's saying to his brother, be rejoiced that your brother is home. That's the parable of the prodigal son in a nutshell. That's my spark notes on it for you. And so I think where that comes into play here is we see some similarities with Sonny, right? Sonny is the one who's done the hard living. And then his older brother, right, is kind of like the older brother in the prodigal son story, right? He's worked hard. He's made the right moral choices. But he's like the brother in the prodigal son, rejected his brother, at least at the beginning of the story. He doesn't even want to help him at the beginning of the story when he learns that Sonny's back in prison. But what you have at the ending of the story is pity, empathy, catharsis, a connection between them, perhaps a forgiveness. And so the prodigal son is just such a powerful story. No matter what you believe, no matter what religion you follow, or maybe you don't follow anything you would call the religion, but we all follow something. We all put our faith, our trust in something. And no matter what you've chosen to put your faith and trust in, there's no denying the power of the story of the prodigal son, because it teaches us about forgiveness. And we see forgiveness. It also teaches us about empathy. There's an empathy, the father has for the prodigal there that his brother's unable to experience, that the narrator's unable to experience with Sonny till the end of the story. And so there's a powerful connection here that we need to explore. Finally, how through parallels between this story and the parable of the prodigal son, Baldwin could potentially be making a commentary on the afterlife and how we reach it, right? We've got a lot of comparisons we can make here, because we can compare this story to everyday use. We can compare it to the prodigal son. We can also compare it to Revelation. So there's a lot of connections that have been building in our course that play out in this story. And if we compare it to Revelation, we think about Mrs. Turpin. Who he reminds you of Mrs. Turpin? Maybe the brother, the narrator, right? Because it's his good works, his providing for his family, rather than run around playing music, doing heroin, that he thinks are the right choices, that will get him wherever he's supposed to be going. Sounds kind of like the older brother and the prodigal son. The older brother and the prodigal son sounds kind of like Mrs. Turpin, right? She's done good things. She may be, like a racist and stuff, but she's helped people, she says. So her works, right? Her good works. Similarly, the older brother, the prodigal son, he's judged his brother. He said he's not worthy. But the prodigal, what he sees is the error of his ways, and he turns around and he runs home. So there's a little girl named Grace in both of these stories as well. And that's very, very important, because that's the lesson of the prodigal son story, right? Is it's grace, not works, that leads the father to put his arms around the prodigal. So This doesn't seem like a story that's about the afterlife, maybe, but when we think about Sonny, we think about the narrator, we think about their relationship, there's much more to the story than it may seem like on the surface. And I'm hoping where I've placed it strategically in our curriculum here, everyday use, revelation, prodigal son, Sonny's Blues, I'm hoping we can see how it is really a meditation on the afterlife. But let's pull on these threads by looking at some quotes from the story. So coming back to that first question, or that first thread rather, about family relationships and Alice Walker's idea that poverty and oppression can really affect them, how does the story depict that? And along those lines, this quote we're going to look at is one of my favorite quotes from the story, and it's a really powerful quote that shows why this story should be read by all kinds of people, all generations, all races, all cultures, all socioeconomic classes. Everyone should read this story for a few quotes, but especially this quote. And this quote addresses how poverty and oppression affect African American sibling and family relationships, but it also asks us to think about the narrator and his attitude towards Sonny. It starts with him learning that Sonny's in jail again for drugs again. And when we see the narrator's reaction, it's so different from his reaction at the end of the story. I was sure that the first time Sonny had ever done horse, he couldn't have been much older than these boys were now. These boys now were living as we'd been living then. They were growing up with a rush, and their heads bumped abruptly against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities. They were filled with rage. All they really knew was darkness, the darkness of their lives, which was now closing in on them, and the darkness of the movies, which had blinded them to that other darkness, and in which they now vindictively dreamed at once more together than they were at any other time, and more alone. So that phrase, the low ceiling of their actual possibilities, they're boys, they have energy, they're playing. I think about my kids and how they play and the energy they have, and how my boys fight with each other. And so I can really relate to this passage, but I'm very blessed that my children have had an easy life, and they haven't had to face a lot of oppression. The boys in this story, like Sonny and his brother, do face oppression, and so their energy, their playing together, bumps against the low ceiling of their actual possibilities, and they're filled with rage. Where does that energy get directed? My boys haven't faced much oppression, but they still fight with each other all the time. I feel like I'm constantly, I have two sons who are just a year and a half apart. They're 5 and 7 right now, breaking up fights between them. But in this story, in the low ceiling of the actual possibilities, there's a darkness closing around them. There's another darkness, the darkness of the movies. So desensitization of our culture, misleading media. That other darkness prevents them from fully seeing the low ceiling of their possibilities, and the darkness that low ceiling covers them in. And that's why they're bumping their heads against it. But they're also bumping against each other because that energy has to be channeled somewhere. And in this scenario, it's channeled into them perhaps fighting against each other. They're more together than they were at any other time because they're in this struggle together. But because of all these circumstances I just mentioned, they're also more alone because they're not just bumping the ceiling. They're bumping each other. They're fighting with each other. They're clashing with each other. And this is the first person narration, right? So Sonny's brother sees this, but at the same time, he doesn't yet have, even though he can see this, he doesn't yet have the empathy for Sonny we might hope he would have. And this is probably his narration looking back years later. So he can eventually see that they were bumping up against each other. They were fighting with each other, and they should have been united by their common struggle. So he sees the family tension that afflicts everyone, but that perhaps is even more predominantly so in families that have faced oppression, the way Alice Walker mentions. And so we get kind of a foreshadowing here of maybe the empathy he could have for Sonny. But what we get at the beginning of the story is a narrator who doesn't even want to go see his brother when he finds out his brother's in jail again. So what changes? Well, his daughter Grace dies, and that completely alters the dynamics of his relationship with Sonny, or at least how he sees it. How does it change their relationship? And when she did scream, it was the worst sound, Isabel says, that she'd ever heard in all her life. And she still hears it sometimes in her dreams. Isabel will sometimes wake me up with a low, moaning, strangled sound, and I have to be quick to awaken her and hold her to me. And where Isabel is weeping against me seems a very mortal wound. I think I may have written Sonny the very day that little Grace was buried. I was sitting in the living room, in the dark, by myself, and I suddenly thought of Sonny. My trouble made his real. This story has 3 quotes that are 3 of the best quotes in all of literature. One of them I read to you on the previous slide. One of them I just read to you. One of them I'm going to read to you on the next slide. But this quote has 2, and I've put in italics because they're some of the greatest things I've ever read. Their daughter, who's a little girl, she's like 2 or 3, and I've got 5 kids, 9 and under, boys and girls, so I know it hits me, and you probably hear that coming through. This is where the pity and the catharsis I've talked about all quarter really comes into play. And my wife and I lost a child, not only at 11 weeks pregnant, so significant, but nothing like what happens to the narrator and Isabel here. But I know the pain. I know my wife's pain to a degree, not to the same degree. And so just, when Isabel wakes up and he's holding her and there's a mortal wound here, I know what he means. But moreover, to connect this quote to the last quote, there's energy. It needs to be channeled somewhere. Where does this go? This experience? Where does it lead the narrator? Where does the mortal wound take him? It's a trouble, to use his words. It's a pain. It's a suffering. The other line here, my trouble made his real. He didn't want to even visit Sonny. But the day his daughter was buried, he writes Sonny for the first time since Sonny's been locked back up in jail. My trouble made his real. He didn't have empathy for his brother before. He had a hardened heart. He said, he's a criminal. He's back in jail. I've tried to help him. It keeps happening. I got to take care of my family. I'm a public school teacher who doesn't make a lot of money. I've got to provide for my family. I can't go visit my brother. I'm paraphrasing. These are his thoughts. But then suddenly and unexpectedly, tragedy strikes. And what does he do? Does he become more hardened? The mortal wound softens him. He writes Sonny a letter. He understands that pain and suffering are part of life, and he understands for the first time that he can't control everything. He's been able to create and provide for a family, so he's been able to control many of the circumstances as an adult in his life by working hard. Sonny hasn't worked hard. He's been in and out of jail. But my trouble made his real. So pity, which we would call empathy, comes into play here because of catharsis. Because we're able to identify with the brother, or we're able to identify with Sonny, but because the brother is able to identify with Sonny. Why did Baldwin name the daughter who dies Little Grace? Think about what the word grace means. An unmerited gift, Someone does something nice for us, even though we don't deserve it. Because you can give a gift for selfish reasons. And I don't mean selfish in an entirely negative way. You can get a mutual benefit out of giving a gift, and that's a wonderful thing. But there's something more wonderful when you give a gift and you get nothing in return. Nothing, not one thing for yourself. That's completely unique, almost unheard of. What could it be? What could that gift be? Maybe someone dies for us. Maybe someone saves us by dying for us. Here in the story, it doesn't benefit the narrator to write Sonny, but he knows some of Sonny's pain. Now he's able to do so. Grace dies. She doesn't choose to die, but she dies. And her death gives the narrator and Sonny a gift. And Baldwin, who grew up studying to be a pastor, chose not to follow through on it for various reasons, but did the studying for it, chooses to name the little girl who makes possible the empathetic connection between Sonny and the narrator. He chose to name her Grace. What happens, though, at the end of the story? So after this, the narrator now has empathy for Sonny. So when Sonny's out of jail, not only does he go see him, he welcomes him into his home. This is a significant change. But he still doesn't truly understand Sonny. Not fully. Not as fully as he can. So one day, Isabel takes the kids out to play. The brothers have an opportunity, a moment, where it's just the two of them on a Sunday afternoon at their house. So they crack open a beer, and out of the blue, the narrator goes and he sees, for the first time, he actually sees Sonny play his music. He has judged Sonny. He has said, music is bad for you. It causes you to do heroin. That causes you to land in jail. Kick it. Be like me. Get a job like a school teacher and be like me. But he says all of that and blames it on the music without ever actually hearing the music. There's something miraculous about music. When you hear it, you think, how did someone create that with their fingers, their mouth? There was nothing there in its creation. All of a sudden, there's this beautiful sound coming out, and different music sounds different and is beautiful to different people in different ways, but there's no denying its beauty, the majesty of its creation, that human beings play a small part in its creation. And in Baldwin, he doesn't tell us that. He shows us that. And the narrator's never learned that. But then he learns it when he sees Sonny play. And here's the last two paragraphs of the story. It's a lot for a PowerPoint, but as I said, they make an argument for two of the greatest paragraphs in the English language, so I'm just going to read them to you, even though they're... Then they all gathered around Sonny, and Sonny played. Every now and again, one of them seemed to say, Amen. Sonny's fingers filled the air with life, his life. But that life contained so many others. And Sonny went all the way back. He really began with the spare, flat statement of the opening phrase of the song. Then he began to make it his. It was very beautiful because it wasn't hurried, and it was no longer a lament. I seemed to hear with what burning he had made it his, with what burning we had yet to make it ours. How we could cease lamenting. Freedom lurked around us, and I understood at last that he could help us to be free if we would listen, that he would never be free until we did, that there was no battle in his face now. I heard what he had gone through and would continue to go through until he came to rest on earth. He had made it his, that long line of which we knew only Mama and Daddy, and he was given it back, as everything must be given back, so that, passing through death, it can live forever. I saw my mother's face again, and felt for the first time how the stones of the road she had walked on must have bruised her feet. I saw the moonlit road where my father's brother died, and it brought something else back to me and carried me past it. I saw my little girl again and felt Isabel's tears again, and I felt my own tears begin to rise, and I was yet aware that this was only a moment, that the world waited outside, as hungry as a tiger, and that trouble stretched above us, longer than the sky. Then it was over. Creel and Sonny let out their breath, both soaking wet and grinning. There was a lot of applause, and some of it was real. In the dark, the girl came by, and I asked her to take drinks to the bandstand. There was a long pause while they talked up there in the indigo light, and after a while I saw the girl put a scotch and milk on top of the piano for Sonny. He didn't seem to notice it, but just before they started playing again, he sipped from it and looked toward me and nodded. Then he put it back on the top of the piano. For me then, as they began to play again, it glowed and shook above my brother's head like the very cup of trembling. So much. I could spend an hour talking about this passage. And as much as I know you'd love that, I'm going to try to spend less than 5 minutes. The story is called Sonny's Blues. The blues were an important part of Harlem at this time, an important part of African American culture. The blues tell a story, and they're the blues. So they tell a story of sadness often. And Sonny is telling a story of sadness, a lament as he plays. And it encompasses people. It encompasses their parents, their long history of oppression their family has experienced. So he's singing the blues, playing the blues, Sonny's blues. But at some point, it ceases to be a lament. And the narrator is empowered. He feels as if he can be free. And if everyone in the room understands, he feels as if Sonny can be free from something too. But then it brings something else back to him. His little girl and Isabel's tears. So Sonny is singing his own pain, their family's pain, but he's also singing his brother's pain, playing his brother's pain. And there's something, dare I say, cathartic, right, about that. Is there a purgation? Emotions are coming out of the narrator, so yes. But is there a purification? Are those emotions being channeled into something better? Is he able to sympathize? The emotions he feels for the loss of his daughter are transformed. They're burnt off. They become purified because they become empathy for Sonny. They're channeled into something positive. And the empathy here for Sonny goes deeper than it's gone ever before, even when he wrote the letter to Sonny, who was in prison on the day Grace died. No, he goes something further because now he understands why Sonny has to play music. He's not here denying that music can lead to drug use, that it can lead to something bad. But he's saying that no matter the cost of the music, he can't give it up because it's catharsis. It brings them together, frees them. They're able to sing their pain and let it out and be united in each other's pain. Grace dies, but in dying, she reunites Sonny and his brother. And here, as her memories come back to him as Sonny plays music, the brother understands Sonny better than he's understood him before. He didn't understand him at all at the start of the story. In the middle of the story, when Grace died, he came to understand him well enough to say, I will welcome you into my home. Here, he understands him well enough to say, I know why you need to play music. And he's never understood that before. And the road is still challenging. There's still trouble outside. There's still, a cup of trembling above his brother's head, but his brother looks at him here, and there's an understanding they didn't have before. And if that's not powerful, if that's not the point of the literature, I don't know what is. So what can you do on a discussion board with that? Analyze the relationship between the narrator and Sonny in the story. What is the main conflict and tension before them? How does their relationship change and evolve as the story's narrative progresses? What message, ultimately, is Baldwin trying to convey about how we interact with and relate to siblings and other members of our family? So coming back to that first question, that first thread about family relationships and how oppression affects them, and you can make the connection here to everyday use if you want, but the next question asks you to do it overtly. More questions than normal. You still only have to answer one for this part 2 of the lecture, but I have more than normal because, like I said, this is a culmination of connections we've been building for the last 3 lessons, including this one. So compare and contrast Sonny and the narrator with Maggie and Dee. What similarities do you see? What differences? How is the ending different here? And if we compare them, it's good to see what's similar. It's also good to see what's different. What can the differences teach us? The next thread we talked about after family and sibling relationships was pity, which is really the idea of empathy. So recall the type of pity we learned about in lesson 1 that appears in tragedies and other great works of literature. This is not how we typically think of pity, but something closer to empathy. Grace's death dynamically changes the relationship between the narrator and Sonny. How does Grace's death help the narrator cultivate pity and empathy for Sonny? Why do you think Baldwin chose to name this little girl Grace? Could Baldwin be using her name to allude to possible paths to redemption for both the narrator and Sonny? So an incredibly important thread that gets at one of the main themes we've discussed all quarter, the pity or empathy that's possible through catharsis, but where that leads us is a path to redemption, right? A path to perhaps even, dare I say, how we reach the afterlife. And if you want to go so far as to connect it to Revelation, just like on the last slide, there's an extra question where you can do that. I mean, these seem like pretty different stories, right? A judgmental racist in a doctor's waiting room who is attacked by a little girl and then realizes she may actually be the devil rather than someone chosen for heaven, compared to 2 African-American brothers struggling with their relationship because of drug addiction who are ultimately redeemed through music. They seem very different, but they both have to do with redemption. They both have to do with how do we get to redemption. And most importantly, they have little girls named Grace who are the turning point of the story. So as different as they seem, how could these stories actually be in actuality conveying a very similar message, potentially? The next thread was music. So how is music important to the story? Why does the narrator initially look down on Sonny's life in the music scene? How does that change in the final 2 paragraphs? And how is music just absolutely fundamental, so essential to understanding what Baldwin is trying to teach us in this story? And here again, I have an extra question for you. So this is where on this slide and the final slide is where you can have 2 questions on the prodigal son. If I think I've kind of made clear throughout the lesson, even if I didn't do it explicitly, how this story connects with the story of the prodigal son. So if you do want to connect them in your writing, here's a couple questions on this slide and the next slide where you could do that. So if you compare them with the prodigal son, I mentioned back on the thread slide how, Sonny reminds us of the prodigal, and the narrator, his brother, reminds us of the older brother from the parable. You can explain those connections, but ultimately where it would be great to see you go with this was here, the brother, the narrator, learns a lesson that the father tries to teach the older brother and the prodigal son, but he doesn't really learn. So what is the lesson? What is the lesson the father is trying to teach in the parable and that the brother learns in Sonny's Blues? And then meditate on why I brought this into the lecture. I kind of gave my reasons, but as usual, I only scratched the surface. So I'd love to hear what you think about why would I ask you to read, these two together. Finally, like the last thread was about the open or close date of Moss. So is the story ambiguous, or the ending, ambiguous or unambiguous? They've taken an important step forward in their relationship, but we don't know what happens next. Now, this isn't a prediction question. I'm not asking you to predict what happens next, but really look at those last two paragraphs of the story. By leaving it a little ambiguous, what is Baldwin trying to teach us? And ultimately, that's more important than whether it's ambiguous or unambiguous, but the potential ambiguity of knowing something amazing, this connection Sonny and the narrator have now, but knowing that trouble is still outside. But perhaps we have a way to fight it now through music, through mutual connection. Perhaps we have a way to combat trouble or suffering. Dig deeper with that one. Finally, then, of course, compare them all. Prodigal Son, Revelation, Sonny's Blues. Heck, you can even throw Everyday Use or Barn Burning in there, whatever you want. But I've done something intentional here, and my goal is not to mislead you or manipulate you. I promise never to do that as an instructor. So I'm laying my cards on the table. I see a very clear connection between this story and the prodigal son. You may not, you may disagree. That's why there's lots of other questions for you to choose from here. And as always, I welcome disagreement and debate. But if you do want to engage with this, kind of the cards on the table disclaimer I have here is the prodigal son is an allegorical lesson from the Bible about how Jesus in the Bible believes we reach salvation, how we reach heaven. So if you want to engage fully with the prodigal son story, and you can kind of engage not to that same degree if you choose question 6, but if you want to engage to the degree that the prodigal son story is about the afterlife, then you have to accept that as context. Again, you don't have to, just if you're answering this question, that's the context. But more generally, you don't have to. So if you do go that route, what is the lesson here? You've got thinking about the lesson from the prodigal son that we can't earn our salvation. We can ask for forgiveness and then the Father can give it if he chooses. Think about that lesson in relation to this vision from O'Connor's revelation of all kinds of people, all classes of society being clothed in whiteness and people with their goodness being burned away. And then Sonny's Blues, those 2 paragraphs that your professor likes so much. Lesson of the prodigal son, final vision from Revelation, final 2 paragraphs from Sonny's Blues. What do they have in common? What are they trying to teach us? I mean, if I'm ever going to make an argument, for why we should study literature, I think you have it in front of you here. Can't wait to read your discussion board posts.